thrilled to be here, and I think you're all like triply fabulous on a Saturday night of a holiday weekend. That must be mentioned again. So I'm very grateful to all of you for coming, and for Muse House, and for our lovely host. This is, I'm just thrilled to be here. And when I speak about my book, people always, and people ask me questions about Henna House, they always start with the same question. People say, Nomi, why did you write a book about Yemenite Jews? Because I'm not Yemenite. And people always want to know why I wrote this book, this particular book. So I like to start out talks by answering that question. And because I'm a writer, I answer that question with a story. And my story goes like this. My father is from Israel, and he had a cousin named Chaim. Chaim was from Belarus, and after the Nazi invasion of Belarus in 1941, Chaim was orphaned, and he set out on an incredible journey. And at the end of the war, Chaim had survived, and he was a child orphan survivor in a displaced persons camp in Germany. An uncle of my father's left what was then pre-state Israel, British Mandate Palestine, and sailed to Europe with the express mission of locating and bringing back with him orphaned children from their family, which was an incredible task. You know, today we have our smartphones and we can look people up. There was nothing, of course, but somehow Uncle Eliyahu found this child, Chaim, in Germany, and he brought him back to pre-state Israel, which meant smuggling him past the British soldiers at the port of Jaffa. And the story of how this uncle smuggled this child in is an incredible story, worthy of another book that I hope I'm writing right now, so that I can come back and talk to you about that one day. Chaim grew up along with my father in a small, beautiful place in Israel called Moshav Abichail, which is near the city of Netanya. Chaim and my father were part of a close, extended group of cousins. They were all the best of friends. Chaim ultimately married a Yemenite Jewish woman named Ahuva. Ahuva's name means beloved. And her family came to Israel in 1950 as part of Operation Magic Carpet, also known as Operation on Wings of Eagles, which I write about in my book. Chaim became a paratrooper, and very sadly, in 1967, he was killed in Jerusalem in the Six-Day War. I was born in 1968. My name is Nomi Eve. Eve is really my middle name, which I use as my pen name. In Hebrew, Eve is Chava. So I'm named Chava after Chaim, this beloved cousin of my father's. I grew up going back and forth to Israel. We lived with my grandparents for 2 months of every year on Moshav Abichail near the city of Netanya. And because I was in Israel for 2 months of every year, I had lots of opportunity to spend time with Chaim's widow, Ahuva, the Yemenite Jewish woman. And because I'm named for her late husband, we always had, and continue to this day, to have a very special bond. So I grew up visiting with Ahuva in her kitchen and helping her make her delicious Yemenite food and listening to her wonderful stories. And I can truly say that she inspired me to write this book. So Yemenite Jewish history and culture is not my history and culture, but it's a history and culture that I feel that I inherited a little bit of along with my name. So that's how I came to write this particular book. Another question people ask me is, what is your book about? Well, my book is about a Yemenite Jewish family. It's narrated by a girl named Adela, who was born in 1918 in a place called the Kingdom of North Yemen. Today, Yemen is one country, but back in the time that I was writing about, Yemen was divided in half. The north was called the Kingdom of North Yemen. It was a Muslim caliphate ruled by an imam. The people who lived in the Kingdom of North Yemen lived their day-to-day lives under ancient laws with no contact with the outside world, no technology. Girls didn't go to school and were illiterate. In the south, the country was divided in half, the Kingdom of North Yemen. The south was called the Aden Protectorate. And the Aden Protectorate was a British protectorate governed by the British Crown. The people who lived in the south had modern technology, cars, airplanes, hospitals. They traveled. The Jews who lived in Aden had British travel documents, which were very rare for that day and age, and could travel the world. And girls from Aden went to school and were literate. As you can imagine, the lives people lived in these two different places were vastly different. And my characters in Henna House come from both the north and the south. And the vast differences in their life experiences play a really big role in my book. Now, I don't know about you, but in so many of the books that I read, the main character is always running away from something and running toward something. There's always something the main character fears and something the main character loves. And in my book, my main character, Adela, is really running away from something called the Orphan's Decree. What is the Orphan's Decree? It was a repressive law in the Kingdom of North Yemen that decreed that any Jewish child whose father died was to be confiscated by the Muslim authorities, converted to Islam, and adopted by a Muslim family. And this child would never see their Jewish. Imagine this law was devastating to the Jews of the Kingdom of North Yemen. And in order to combat the Orphan's Decree, they came up with an ingenious plan. They realized that if they engaged and married off their children as children, that the children would be protected from confiscation because marriage was a protection against confiscation. In my book, in Henna House, Adela, my main character, is at risk for confiscation. Her father is very sickly, and for most of the book, she's terrified that she's going to be confiscated. And how her family tries to protect her from confiscation makes up a lot of sort of the juicy plot of the book. Who she gets engaged to, who she gets engaged to after that, when that doesn't work out, and so on and so forth. So in Henna House, confiscation is what my main character is really running away from. But what does she run towards? What does she love? What makes her smile? And Adela comes from a family of professional henna artists. And when I say henna, I'm talking about the elaborate designs that women and girls paint on their skin, especially to celebrate life cycle moments, particularly engagements or marriage. And I don't know about you, but I always thought that henna was purely an Indian tradition. But when I was doing my research for this book, I learned that all the Jews of the Arab lands, not just Yemen, had their own precious henna life cycle rituals. When I learned about henna, I just was smitten. I fell in love with the symbol and story and sisterhood of henna. And as I said, Adela comes from a family of professional henna artists. Around a quarter of the way into the book, her cousin Hani comes from the south, from Aden, and teaches Adela the mystery and magic and symbology of henna. And Hani also teaches Adela something else, which will lead into the passage I'm going to read. Hani also teaches Adela how to read and write. Hani brings with her not only the gifts of henna, but also the gifts of literacy. So the part I'm going to read to you comes from around midway into my book, and Adela and her family have left their houses, left their homes because of drought and political oppression, and they are walking south, down from through the mountains, and they're trying to get to the port city of Aden, which I must say that as I'm saying this, it makes me think of the migrants in Europe right now. You know, we write stories of long, long ago, but stories are acted out and over again. You know, and that's why we have to keep telling these stories and learning from them. Anyway, Adela and her family had to leave their homes. They walked for miles and miles and miles, and they were trying to get to Aden. And ultimately, when they did get to Aden, they were They were rescued by the new Israeli government that flew these secret missions to take the entire Jewish community out of Yemen and fly them to Israel, which is an incredible story. It's something called Operation Magic Carpet, and I do write about it in my novel, so you can read about it there. Anyway, Adela and her family are walking down through the mountains, and in the part that I'm going to read you, they come across an incredible group of people, a group of people called Habani Jews. And the Habani Jews were different from all the other Yemenite Jews, and different from all the other Jews you've ever heard of. They were a nomadic tribal people. They were polygamous. To look at them, they were astonishingly interesting. They wore elaborate headdresses and makeup and kohl and tribal markings. And in Yemen, all Muslim men in Yemen wore, and still today many do wear, elaborate curved scimitars, knives, as part of their everyday dress. And the only Jews in Yemen who were allowed to wear these curved scimitars, these jambia, were the Habani Jews, because they were known as fierce warriors who in ancient days were known as the bodyguards to the Imam. So Adela and her family come across a family of these Habani Jews, and I'm going to read you this tiny little interlude about what happens when they meet. I will read you, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 pages, so not very long, and then we'll do our chat. Okay. And the only characters you need to know are Adela, my narrator, who at this point is probably around, I think, 12 or 13, no, I really should check that, and her cousin Hani, who's just a little bit older. Toward the end of our journey, we met up with a curious group of travelers, a large extended family of Habani Jews camped by the banks of the Horeba River. They were very far from their homeland in the Hadramut, where the Habanim had lived since King Herod dispatched a brigade of Judeans to fight with the Roman legions in Arabia. The Hadramut was the name for the land bound by Aden to the west, Oman to the east, the Red Sea to the south, and the Rub al-Khali to the north. It was the scorched hem of the skirt on the southernmost tip of Arabia. It was puzzling to find the Habanim here, north and west of Aden, in such a beautiful spot. The gray gold rocky mountains rose up on all sides, but the land around the river was jungle green, dense, with big leafed trees draped in flowered creepers, a welcome respite from the desert landscape. Yellow and orange butterflies danced through the air, and birds of every color flitted and chirped overhead. The family was camped in little reed huts. Their patriarch was a tall man whose naked, muscular chest was shiny with oil under a blue prayer shawl, draped over one shoulder. In the Muslim style, he wore a big curved jambia on a belt around his waist. To cover his sex, he had only an indigo-colored loincloth. His thick, curly hair was tied with a thong, and he wore no earlocks, which was strange. I had never seen a Jewish man without earlocks. His face was sharp, his features angular, eyebrows very bushy, mustache clipped. I had never seen Habanim before, and had to stop myself from staring at the almost naked men, though it was the woman who most intrigued me. They were adorned head to toe in the most beautiful jewelry I had ever seen. All of it had been made by the patriarch, their husband and father. At least this is what they led us to understand. They had so many necklaces, it looked as if their heads were being held up by the tiny metal links of their chains. Is this making a rattling sound that's very annoying, or is it just me? We're okay, okay. The tiny metal links of their chains, not by their own flesh and bones. They wore filigree discs on thick chains, as well as 6 or 7 beaded necklaces, layered one on top of the other, all hung with amulet boxes. Their wrists were adorned with thick silver bracelets, 5 or 6 on each arm, set with carnelians and coral. and they had rings on every finger. Their hair was plaited in graceful manes of tiny braids that hung free around their shoulders, topped only by little embroidered diadems on their foreheads, instead of garbushim or kerchiefs. Even the youngest girls were dressed like this, like wild little desert brides. On their foreheads, some of the women and girls wore black gall dots. Others wore kohl under dark eyes, or triangle markings on their cheeks and mouths, just the way Aunt Rachel had marked me when we went to Sana. We came to understand that 3 of the women were wives of the patriarch, who was a skilled silversmith, and that most of the 13 or 14 children belonged to him as well. We spent the morning gathering herbs and berries and replenishing our bladders of water, for the water from the river was sweet. Then we were invited by the Habanim to share their lunch of peppery soup and bread. After eating, our men joined theirs to pray the afternoon liturgy. Some of the Habani women and girls sat in a circle, embroidering a big green cloth that they told me would be used for a wedding canopy. One of the older girls in the family was to be married in a few weeks. I brought handwork and sat on a flat rock close to one of the Habani huts. A few of the little girls were playing near where I was sitting. After a few minutes of work, I absent-mindedly put down my embroidery and picked up a stick. I crouched down and doodled some letters in the sandy earth, Vav and Zayin. One of the little girls inched over to see what I was drawing. She had heavy-lidded eyes, long lashes, a snub nose, and plump lips. The black ball markings on her cheeks were little upside-down triangles. She had thick silver hoops in her ears and many necklaces and bracelets. After watching me for a minute, she reached out her arm, let it hover for a second or two in the air, and then gently put her hand over my own. Her bracelet slid down her arm, making a tinkling sound, which added to the gentle music of the flowing river water. She had a ring on each finger except for her thumbs. Her palm was warm on my hand, but the rings were cold on my knuckles. "No," she said, "Sister, whoever you are, let me do it with you." She held on to me like a little monkey. I smiled. You want to write with me?" She shrugged. "Let me do it with you," she repeated. I thought for a moment, and then I wrote Aleph, her hand fast on my own, then Samech and Pei. I let the stick rest between my legs. She was squatting by our letters and now rocked back and forth on her heels. "What is your name?" I asked. "Esther," she said. "Pretty name for a pretty girl. Would you like to see your name? Yes? Come here, darling. Put your hand back on mine. That's right." Together we wrote her name, Esther. And then I drew a little crown over it. "Like Queen Esther," I said, "you too may wear a crown." She squealed with delight and called to her sisters. Soon I had written the names of 4 little girls in the earth. And one by one they had put their hands over mine, helping me form the letters. Over in the culvert, the voices of the men gliding up and down the liturgy reached us in an emphatic crescendo. A tall woman with heavy-lidded eyes came over and clucked for her daughter, little Esther, who had started me on my naming game. The girl went to her mother and then disappeared behind her. "What is it? What are you doing?" The woman squatted down by the scribbled harvest of names. Just showing the girls how to write their names." "Huh?" "Just their names, nothing more. See, there it is, Esther." I pointed to the first name, the one with the crown. The woman squinted, puffed out her cheeks, then thrust her tongue through a blank spot in her teeth. She made a tisking sound. My heart fluttered, for she looked angry, and I knew that my mother would chastise me for making trouble with strangers we met on the road. But then I remembered, with the shock of the newly bereft, that my mother was dead and would never chastise me again. I suffered a terrible pang at this knowledge, for in the strange way that a captive will grow to love her captor, I would miss my mother's constant rages and disapproval. I looked over to where our men were praying with their men. I was sure that the Habani men had learned to read as little boys, but these women and girls were as ignorant as I had been before the other Damaris had come to Kara. Had I overstepped? But then the woman's face warmed in a broad, open-mouthed smile. She pointed to her own chest, thumping the red, yellow, and green embroidery under her many necklaces. "Rosa," she said. "My name is Rosa." She put out her thin, calloused hand, encased in an ornate sarcophagus of rings and bracelets. She clutched onto my hand over the stick. I was startled. "Rosa," she repeated. "I am Rosa." She wanted a lesson too. "And I am Adela," I said. "Here, I will show you how to write your name." I formed the Resh and Vav and Zayin and Hey, and when I was finished, I added a little flower next to it. All the while, she held on to me like a rag doll, slack-wristed, so that I could move for the two of us without any resistance. Rosa called to one of her sister wives. Rosa calls to one of her sister wives, a younger woman with a high forehead, a nose like an upside-down arrow, long lashes atop piercing eyes. Her name was Henna, and I wrote her name too. Henna called to her daughters, four leggy girls who looked like miniature versions of their mother. Hani came along to see what I was doing. As soon as she understood the lesson, she picked up a stick and began to write, just as I was writing, with an extra hand atop her own. "So we have a school?" Hani asked, smiling and squatting behind the smallest girl, a little jewel with green eyes who had a zigzag scar on one cheek. "How wonderful," Hani said. "The School of the Road, we can call it. The School of the Road for Girls."